Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brett Perlman, President and CEO of the Center for Houston's Future. Welcome to our third webcast in our series of civic leaders discussing how the pandemic has changed our region and what the post-pandemic future might hold. Before we get into today's program, I'd like to briefly talk about the Center. For those of you who don't know us, we are a 20-year-old nonprofit that brings together business, government, and community stakeholders to engage in fact-based strategic planning, collaboration, and action on issues of great importance to the Houston region. Currently, our strategic work is focused in three areas: in climate and energy, in the importance of immigration, and in healthcare and health equity. And through our business and civic leadership program, we train leaders to deepen their community involvement. We also seek to engage the community through webcasts like this one, but we hope to return to in-person events next year. In the meantime, our next webcast, part of our Energy and Climate Thought Leader series, is October the 6th, with Catherine Hayhoe, who is a globally renowned climate scientist. See the chat to register for that event. And we couldn't do programs like this one without the generous support of our donors. We'd like to specifically thank some of our major supporters: the MD Anderson Foundation, the Energy Foundation, the John Zuckerberg Initiative, and corporate support from Centerpoint, Chevron, the DeMontron Group, HCA Houston Healthcare, KPMG, Merrick, Shell, Wells Fargo, and in-kind support from the Greater Houston Partnership. And thank you to all our individual supporters, including our Founders Circle members who have continued to support the Center through our leadership campaign, which we're relying on in place of our in-person events. This campaign is currently underway, and we'd be grateful for your support at any level. We'll put a link in the chat if you're interested. So now we're honored to have Ann Stern, President and CEO of the Houston Endowment, and Scott McClelland, President of HEB Food and Drug Stores, to join us today. We're going to discuss how the pandemic has impacted our community and what role major foundations and philanthropy will play in addressing these issues. We're going to take questions at the end, so feel free to put your comments in the chat and we'll get to them later on. So over to you, Scott, and Ann, looking forward to this conversation.
Great. Thanks, Brett. And hello, everybody. It's good to be with you today. You know, to say that this last year and a half has been difficult is really an understatement. Not only has the pandemic affected us in so many different ways, but then in the middle of it, we experienced the George Floyd murder, which really changed the way in which we looked at racial and social injustice. And issues that were big over the course prior to the pandemic have just gotten bigger, and then new ones have emerged. And I think one of the things that we found that as Houstonians, it's going to take all of us working together to overcome a lot of these, but really at the center of what helps us through this is looking at what philanthropies do. And so I'm pleased today to have a conversation with Ann Stern, who is the CEO of the Houston Endowment. Houston Endowment was formed 80 years ago by Jesse Jones and Mary Gibbs, and today it's one of the largest private philanthropic institutions in the region. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about Ann. She's the president and CEO of the Houston Endowment. Before joining the endowment, she was a executive vice president at Texas Children's Hospital. Her background includes private law practice and teaching business at the University of St. Thomas. She currently serves on the board of directors for Invesco Funds, the University of Texas Law School Foundation, the Holdsworth Center, which is an education foundation, Good Reason Houston, which is an education nonprofit. She's also a member of the Baker Institute Board of Advisors. Previously, she served as chairman of the St. John's School and on the boards of the Federal Reserve and Texas Children's Hospital. She earned her bachelor's degree in Plan 2 from UT Austin, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. See, where I went to school, I thought that was a sorority. Apparently it's bigger than that. And then she also received her Juris Doctorate from UT Austin also. So Ann, welcome to you. Glad to be with you today. Normally, Ann and I see each other early in the morning at the gym, and I guess the final exclamation point I'd put on her bio is she's a beast in the gym in terms of working out. She is a hard one to keep up with, that's for sure. So how are you doing today? Good?
Thank you, Scott. I'm doing great. Had a good workout this morning.
Good for you. All right, well, for starters, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to into philanthropy? Obviously, you went from law practice to Texas Children's, and this was somewhat of a career change. So what led you to where you are today?
Yeah, I thought I was going to be a corporate lawyer for my career, and that didn't turn out to be the case. I'd say the path to philanthropy began when I was at Texas Children's. And especially when I moved from the legal role, from the general counsel role into a business clinical operations strategy role as executive vice president. In that role, I worked alongside some just truly remarkable people. And so you'd think about the fantastic nurses and the clinicians, the doctors, the research scientists, and they were amazing. But I'd say what had an even greater influence on my career path was the interaction with the families who were in our hospital fighting for their children's health and sometimes their lives, and many of them dealing with just incredible challenges at home. Lack of health insurance, substandard housing that meant their children were ending up in the ER, frequent flyers in our ER. People who were going to lose their jobs if they stayed in the hospital with their kids, people who lacked transportation to get to critical treatments for their children. These things that weren't healthcare issues all created barriers to great health outcomes for their kids, no matter how great the care was they were receiving in our hospital. And so, and then sick children aren't in school, so their educational outcomes suffer. So it really put a face for me on how these issues, all associated with poverty, can really interact in destructive ways, and they can limit or even destroy opportunity for so many people in our region. Philanthropy is well suited to be able to take on and address some of these complex issues to help more people realize their potential. And I have to say, as a lifelong Houstonian, it was a powerful draw to come work for an organization whose sole purpose is to make life better for the people of Greater Houston.
I mean, I think there's really no place where you see people at such a great vulnerability as when they're in the hospital, and illness has no demographic boundaries, right? I mean, everyone from rich to poor to every ethnicity, and it really had to be eye-opening to see a lot of the issues and the pain that people had that just put an exclamation point on the personal issues that they were trying to overcome.
People going through things that you can only imagine, and as a parent, it really hits home.
Yes, I can only imagine. Well, not everyone on the call today necessarily knows a lot about the Houston Endowment. And so can you tell a little bit about its history and the role that it plays in the community?
Yes, we're celebrating our birthday with our staff later today, our 84th birthday. Houston Endowment is a private foundation, as you mentioned. It was founded by Jesse and Mary Gibbs Jones. And I'll say a few words about Jesse Jones because he continues to be such a powerful influence on who we are. He was a businessman who came to Houston at the turn of the century to work in his uncle's lumber business. And he only had an 8th grade education, but he had this big vision for his adopted city. He wanted Houston to be world class. And obviously in the early 1900s, Houston was not a world class city. He brought the Democratic National Convention to Houston in 1928. That was the first party convention in the South after the Civil War, either party. He secured the private funding necessary to draw down the federal dollars and build the ship channel, which has to be considered one of the greatest public-private partnerships of all time. He sort of coerced a lot of local businessmen to bail out regional banks when they started to fail at the Great Depression. He was really a doer. And because of all those things, he was called up to Washington and became chairman of the Reconstruction Finance Company, and then became President Roosevelt's chief of commerce, and served the country in those roles. But he came back to Houston after that, and that's when he founded Houston Endowment. He wanted Houston Endowment to help improve the lives of Houstonians. So that's what Houston Endowment's been doing for 84 years. And it basically supports nonprofits, and it does it through the arts, through healthcare, through all sorts of social service organizations. So if you think about Jones, he was a huge visionary, but he was also a man of action. He worked tirelessly to make the city a better place. He recruited others to sort of join him in his efforts. And he took very progressive stands on things for his day. One of his signature programs, the Jones Scholars Program that he started in the 50s, gave scholarships to two girls and two boys in every public school in Houston. So it was sort of a big deal to give scholarships to girls, college scholarships to girls, but this was also a time of segregated education systems. And so he was also giving scholarships to many, many students of color. And he really felt like that was a great investment in the future of the city. So the endowment has grown a lot. Today we have $2.4 billion in assets, but Jones's influence continues to be felt, and it's really his legacy that inspires and drives our work today.
I knew some of Jesse Jones, but I didn't realize all of that, and that's a significant past and an impressive one. You know, before I got to really know very much about the philanthropic world, I thought, you know, it's got to be a great job. I mean, you just get to give money away to people. And then as I got to learn a little bit more about it, like, oh, well, it's not always that fun because you have to say no to a lot of people. But I think one of the things that's a question mark for lots of folks is, how do you decide? Like, with all the requests that come in, and especially when Hurricane Harvey rolls in, or with the pandemic, I'm sure you guys got flooded with requests. So how do you make decisions around how you fund? How do you approach strategic intent?
Well, we're really lucky. I mean, one of the things that Jesse Jones sort of famously said was, how in the world would I know what the needs are of Houston in the next century? And so I'm going to leave that up to future leaders to be able to determine how to have the most impact with the assets of this organization. And so we do have a lot of freedom. But about 8 years ago, we were in a discussion in the boardroom, and we realized that the foundation was going to deploy about $1 billion over the next 10 years. It may end up being even more than that. And we said, you know, with that amount of money, we should really have a big impact, and not just an impact, but a sustainable impact. And then we went through a strategic planning process and realized that we were working on 40 different issues. By some counts, 60, depending on how you defined that. And no one with our amount of resources can have major impact on 40 to 60 different issues. We also realized that our non-financial resources were substantial. And by that, I mean that when we combine our dollars with our other assets, like our staff expertise and time, our voice, the influence we may have with our partnerships and relationships in the community, that we could have that much more impact. So we created a strategic framework that would include not just what we were going to fund, but how we were going to fund it. And so in terms of what we fund, we're anchored around two deep commitments, and that is pre-K-12 public education and civic engagement. We're going to fight for change in those two areas over the next 20 plus years. We're going to allocate well over 60% of our resources annually, and we're going to deploy every non-financial asset that we have that we think will help. And that's exactly what we should be doing as a private foundation. We can make long-term commitments, stay in things on the long haul, and sort of persevere through the ups and downs. We continue to fund the arts. We made a commitment to that. We continue to fund parks. We believe particularly park access is important and should be equitable. And we keep dry powder and the flexibility to be able to respond to emerging community needs and opportunities. And the way that we do this, before I get to the how, the professional staff is really taking the strategic framework and then proactively working out in the community to figure out what are the strategies we can deploy that will make the biggest difference. They're developing recommendations and they're bringing them back to the board, but it's all couched in terms of, we've agreed on this strategic framework, we've agreed on what we're trying to achieve, and now the staff should go out and figure out how we can actually do that. I would also say, in terms of how we work, we've incorporated more practices from the private sector. I mean, I think about HEB, and I think about, you know, if you all were trying to figure out how to have impact, there's certain things you do. You know, you have a clear vision and goals. You have strategies that make sense based on the research and their sound theories. You execute with discipline. You have systems for sort of learning and for accountability. And of course, I can't say enough in our organization, like yours, about the culture and the people. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what really is the magic that gives you the ability to have impact. So we've invested in all those things. And I can't say that HEI runs like HEB, but I can say that we've adopted a lot, incorporated a lot from the private sector, and it's made us better. Unique to a private foundation, I think, unique is probably too strong a word, but something that characterizes the work of a private foundation. We've started doing a lot more of convening people and bringing coalitions together, sometimes creating formal coalitions. As you know, these issues are incredibly complex. None of us are going to solve them by ourselves. And so creating coalitions from the business, public, nonprofit, philanthropic sector is essential. I mean, you and I were part of the group that founded Good Reason Houston to really create a community vision and action around public education. The second thing we've done, when I first got to Houston Endowment, we didn't do a lot of partnering with the public sector. The notion was the public sector already has a lot of dollars. We have nothing to add there. Well, it's certainly true that our dollars pale in comparison to the dollars in the public systems. But if you really want to change education, healthcare, immigration, housing, you have to partner with the public sector. And so what we can do is we can provide discretionary funding to help public leaders, give them sort of the space and the bandwidth to be able to figure out how to use their public dollars more wisely, or test innovative approaches that they can then expand, or even fund dollars to inform public policy change. One example of that, we are very excited about the new HISD superintendent, Millard House. And, if you were coming in as a new CEO of a major organization, which he is in the private sector, you'd have dollars and you'd focus on transition and you'd set a vision and a strategic plan and you'd have the resources to do that. Hard to find discretionary resources in the public system. And so we are funding $1 million to HISD to help him have the time for a really successful transition and strategic planning process. So, and the only other thing I'll say that we have realized every day, more and more how important this is to engage with the community, the people we serve, to really be intentional about listening and learning from the people we serve. You know, our grantees are not our customers. Our grantees are our partners. The people we serve, our clients, those are greater Houstonians. And so we really need to understand their perspectives as we start to create strategies to drive this work.
Good. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you. One of the things I've been impressed at, and maybe this is the wrong term to use, but I'll try it anyway, is it strikes me that at the Houston Endowment, you look at performance-based philanthropy. In other words, you're interested in funding change and seeing results. And I think virtually every nonprofit is well-intentioned. Some are organized and have better plans in place, but has that evolved over time in terms of how you've looked at that? And that's got to be, it's rigor that you put into what you do. It's also got to be somewhat challenging, I would think.
Yeah, it is challenging, but I think that's a great word for it, performance-based philanthropy. And we owe it to the community to use these dollars for the greatest impact. That doesn't always make everyone happy because it means we can't address every issue, we can't fund every nonprofit at the same time. But I think it's our fiduciary responsibility and certainly the responsibility I feel to Jesse and Mary Gibbs Jones. But one key word is impact. I think, like many philanthropies, we shifted from thinking, okay, we've got to get 5% out the door. So let's get 5% out the door in a way that complies with all the rules and gets into the hands of really strong nonprofits. That's good. That's good. There's nothing wrong with that. But how much more impact, if you start to focus on impact, then you've got to focus on fewer things at a time, and you've got to be really disciplined about how you go about it.
And I think one of the things that that I'll just talk about education where you and I do work, is the amount of overlap that exists, again, from well-intentioned nonprofits that start up. But if you think about book distribution to kids, is you probably have 6 different organizations that are all trying to distribute books, many of them into the same zip codes. And so how do you, to your point, is put it together for the greatest impact and bring some organization to, because you see a much bigger picture than what an individual charity would see. If we were to go to LA or New York or Dallas, would we see the same sort of philanthropic framework in those communities? And is there a large backbone philanthropy like what the Houston Endowment would be? Or does it the way philanthropy's approach differ from city to city?
Well, when I first took this job, I went on a listening tour of some of our foundation peers, looking for best practices. And what I found was a lot of good practices, but not a lot of consistency. And as someone said, when you see one foundation, you've seen one foundation. I will say that private foundations and place-based foundations, this is a sector that is not competitive at all. And so there is a wonderful learning community across the country of other foundations that are addressing many of the same issues that we're addressing. The context is always a bit different, so you can't just automatically adopt what they're doing in LA or Miami or Pittsburgh, but you can learn a lot. We were working on homelessness a number of years ago, and there were a lot of tours that came to Houston led by other foundations trying to learn from Houston about what we were doing here. So the flavor is different, but I'd say who I consider to be the really effective private foundations across the country are sort of trying to learn the same sorts of things that we're learning and bringing together or partnering with people across all sectors in the same way that we are.
So you talked about education as being one sector, and then you talk about civic engagement. So under civic engagement, are there a series of blanks or areas that you focus on there?
Yeah, it goes back to, for Houston to fully realize the value and potential of its diversity. We feel like all residents need to be informed and engaged in the decisions that impact their lives. And we know communities are stronger, more resilient, more cohesive when residents are informed and engaged in civic processes. And that's all processes. I mean, you want them to be part of the PTA at their children's schools, and you want them to run for the school board, and you want them to know what's going on and vote in all elections. We also know that democracy itself is stronger when all eligible voters participate in the electoral process. So we've sort of anchored around 2 things. One is immigrant civic integration. We know that 25% of Harris County residents are foreign born, a full quarter. And while most of the people I talk to are so proud about Houston's diversity, not everyone realizes that we don't do a great job of integrating immigrants into our communities. And so it's reflected in low rates of electoral participation, but a number of other things as well. So that's one thing. And then we also know that Black Americans still face disproportionate hurdles to get to the ballot box. So the endowment civic engagement work is focusing on strengthening immigrant civic integration and on increasing electoral participation, and particularly in historically disenfranchised communities. Give you a couple of examples because our work is nonpartisan and non-political, but we did support Harris County's multimedia Vote Your Way communications campaign before the last election. The purpose of it was, especially during COVID, to help all eligible voters really understand how they could vote safely and securely. COVID actually created an opportunity for the county to implement some innovative ways of voting. I know I have a lot of friends and colleagues who loved the drive-through voting, for example. That made a huge difference. And when you look at the participation rates, they went up. We should be really proud about that as a region. We should be building on that. That's an opportunity to do more. And so to that end, earlier this year, we funded $1 million to Harris County's, to the Office of the Elections Administrator And it's towards an open data portal. That's going to enable them to really look at the data and transparently see what's working, what's increasing participation, what should we do more of, less of, just how do we get better? How do we increase voter participation in the future? It's another great example of philanthropy partnering with the public sector.
Yeah, in addition to, I think, partnering with the public sector, one of the things I've been impressed with is that you've also partnered with other large foundations in terms of making your money, realizing that 1 + 1 = 4. I mean, could you cite some of the examples where you've done that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel so lucky. I feel lucky to live in Houston for a whole lot of reasons, but in this role, I feel so fortunate to have strong foundation partners. And with Good Reason Houston, let's talk about Good Reason Houston for a minute.
Oh, let's do.
Let's do. You're the board chair. I'm a former board chair. We partnered, we all worked together to create this. And boy, the Kinder Foundation has been such an amazing partner in funding this, been step for step with us along the way to make this happen. And, you know, never has it been more important. And I just want to sort of use this time to sort of raise a couple of issues, which I know won't be news to you. But we all know how significant learning loss has been during COVID. And I just wanted to share some frightening statistics with our audience today. In 2019, 37% of third graders in the Houston area were reading at grade level. And that's really important because you learn to read up to third grade, and then after third grade, if you can't read, you really don't learn because you're reading to learn. After 2021, after COVID, that number fell from 37% at proficiency to 27% at proficiency. And just to take that further, the STAR proficiency scores in math for grades 3 through 8 declined faster and further than the reading scores. And those gaps in performance all across the board, everything that we track, further widened for economically disadvantaged students and Black and Latino students. So we're in the middle of a crisis that not enough people are talking about. And every Houstonian, every person in this region should be standing up, should know these statistics, should be demanding better for all our children. Every Houstonian should be asking what they can do to change this picture. Because this is not a problem for our school districts to solve on their own. This is a problem for the entire community to engage in solving, and solving it for good. We should be the city that figures out how to do this, how to make sure all our kids have a great education, access to a great public school. So that is just this morning, I'm feeling like this, so grateful that we've had the chance to create Good Reason Houston, and want to support it. And I would love to hear how you're thinking about education, public education, and Good Reason Houston now, and why you have made, as busy as you are, why you have made this such a priority.
Sure. Well, I think for folks who aren't familiar with Good Reason Houston, is that it exists to do away with D and F schools. So schools are rated A through F. Today, 14% of all schools in the greater Houston area are rated D or F, which doesn't mean every teacher in those schools is poor, but what it says is that the outcomes that they're able to achieve, despite their effort, aren't good. 51% of all schools are C, D, or F. Like, who wants to go to a school that's average at best and maybe even failing? And so that's really what we exist to do, is to turn that around so that all kids, regardless of your zip code or regardless of your parents, have the chance for quality of education. Now, why this is important, frankly, as a business person, is it is our future workforce. In its simplest definition, a school is a manufacturing plant. They take raw material, uneducated kids, they add value, and hopefully they're either workforce ready or secondary. Only 22% of everyone who graduates from high school in the greater Houston area goes on to get a 2-year or 4-year degree. Yet almost 70% of the new jobs require a 2-year or 4-year degree, which means we've got to import a lot of talent. And so that's the big opportunity. And that's why I've gotten involved, as have you. And like, we feel so fortunate that the Houston Endowment and the Kinder Foundation have really been our key sponsors on this, along with a lot of other people too. So, you know, I think it's good work, but you really point to an important point, which is COVID changed a lot. And so as you look at your entire landscape, obviously education is one sector, But what was the impact of COVID? And I guess you got to roll the George Floyd murder into that because they're somewhat linked. They occurred at the same time. But how have things changed for you guys over the course of last year?
Yeah, well, I guess 2 points. One was, as a place-based foundation.
Sorry, my lights just went out. Hang on.
I won't take it personally.
That's okay. Yeah.
As a place-based foundation, we first sort of touched base with our grantees, and for some of them, we wanted to get them additional general operating support just so they could keep doing what they were doing and being asked to do more of all of a sudden. We reduced and in some cases even eliminated our application and reporting requirements. We didn't want to be an additional burden on them. And we did use some of our dry powder to, for example, Collaborative for Children did such a great job working on a citywide child care plan for essential workers. We contributed and funded that, helped set that up. And we gave $2 million to the Joint City-County COVID Relief Fund just to help people with immediate needs, people who were just really struggling as jobs were going away. But we also saw, and you said this earlier, Scott, COVID in some ways, while it has created some new problems, it most notably from our view has just exacerbated the existing ones. And so we didn't want to lose sight. We didn't want to lose focus on the things that we had set out to have an impact on. And so we've just talked about some of the impact on schools. We've tried to focus on that. We saw opportunity based on what happened with some of the electoral participation innovations. In the arts, certainly all of the arts were impacted by COVID, but the ones who suffered the most, not surprisingly, were some of our diverse arts organizations who have historically been underfunded. They just haven't received the same level of support from the community. And so one thing that we're really excited about, and we're partnering with the Ford Foundation on this, which has been fun. Ford put out invited 7 regions across the country to participate with them on regional initiatives. And so Ford put up $5 million, we put up $5 million. We have been joined by the Kinder Foundation, Powell Foundation, Cullen Foundation, Brown Foundation, so grateful for their support to come together and create a fund that will be community-led, that will support and bolster Houston's arts organizations, BIPOC, which for those who, I won't use acronyms without explaining them, Black, Indigenous, people of color-led organizations. Houston's one of only 7 regions, the only one in the South, and every region has had the autonomy to set up the initiative the way they wanted to. And so really excited that in Houston, it will be independently led by a community board of artist leaders and funders, and they're going to be the ones who establish the funding criteria and who award $2 million this year with plans for additional rounds of grants in the coming years. So not only do we get unrestricted support to organizations really hurting as a result of COVID, but we also lift up and hopefully introduce more Houstonians to these cultural treasures that are really unique to Houston. And then from Houston Endowment, we're excited because we're going to get to learn more about a new, more community-driven way of grant making. So those are some of the things. But COVID has been a huge factor in our work, but I want to speak specifically about the murder of George Floyd and the impact that's had on our work. Given the endowment's mission, which has a large focus on advancing equity of opportunity, we see and we address racial inequity and injustice as part of almost all our work. And that's been true for a long time. But still, as the calls for racial and social justice sort of captured the nation's attention, we ask ourselves, what more can we do? What are we missing? What are our blind spots? Because we just felt certain we had them. And one of the things that we came to realize is that while we had been addressing issues related to racism and social injustice, we hadn't been talking explicitly about it. And we needed to do that. And so that's changed. We also, like so many organizations, immediately following George Floyd's murder, we made a statement. We sort of hated to do that because there were a lot of statements, but we also felt like it was critical that we be formal about our explicit commitment to fighting anti-Black racism. But we didn't want it to stop with, a statement without actions doesn't mean very much. And so our board approved a $25 million racial justice fund to fight anti-Black racism. And the initial 20 million was deployed to 55 organizations across the region. There was really not a formal, they were invited before there was any application. So we tried to make this as simple as possible. And these organizations range from large educational institutions like Prairie View A&M and TSU for criminal justice work, to very small grassroots organizations that are doing amazing work on the front lines of communities, arts organizations, criminal justice organizations. It sort of ran the gamut, but they all are fighting directly on the front lines of racial justice. So we're excited about learning from those organizations before we deploy the additional $10 million. We also had to look internally. About 5 years ago, we started diversity, equity, inclusion training and assessment internally. And we realized we needed to move with more urgency. So, and we also wanted to be more specific, set specific goals. We adopted the Meyer Memorial Trust instrument. It measures a variety of different dimensions of internal organizations. And so as part of that, we've done board and staff training. We've done more of it. And we're also in the process of doing a policy audit just to make sure that we're not missing anything in terms of our internal policies and practices. So we'll continue to be conscious of what our specific goals are as an internal organization. That's important to be able to do our work.
I think if you look back at the last year, not only has there been the fallout from the George Floyd murder and the need to look at racism in particular and social inequity in the Black community, but if you look at the Asian hate that has come out of COVID-19, if you look at all the frustration with the lack of immigration policy and what we see happening on the border right now in Del Rio today, and the outcry simply of moving many of those immigrants from Del Rio into Houston. And as a city, we've taken such pride in being the most diverse city, and that's the wrong descriptor, because what we really need to be is the most inclusive city. And we find that that takes work, but also I think takes curiosity in terms of understanding everything you can about the subject and not being caught in your own paradigm of how you were raised or who you were, in terms of thinking that you understand the impact of what social issues and legislation has on these communities when we don't stand in their shoes. And it's really, I think, only by studying, learning, that you can have greater empathy for what's going on and maybe pushing us from being diverse to being inclusive. See it that way?
Absolutely. And there's a personal component to this work that is essential. I mean, you cannot hope to move forward in a professional standpoint to be more inclusive if you don't do the work personally. Yeah. And it just starts with curiosity and openness.
You know, one of the things people oftentimes ask me about Central Market, and the question I get asked the most is, why don't you carry Diet Coke? And I always say Central Market is defined as much by what it doesn't carry as by what it does. It helps you in terms of what it is that you stand for. So if you kind of look at what you've said that you stand for, you know, you're looking at education and civic engagement, then the flip side of that is you had to make intelligent choices to not do things, which is painful to do. But what are some of the things that you've chosen not to fund? Not that they aren't important, but you had to set bandwidth, right?
Yeah, I'll go back to that list of 40/60 different issues that we had. And, I think that's one of the hardest things is some of the reaction we got from people when we told them that we were shifting our focus. And it didn't mean we would never fund what they were doing. And it didn't mean that if just fantastic opportunity came up that we wouldn't be open to it, but it just meant that we were going to reduce our funding over the next several years. What was really hard was that people were afraid that that was going to be viewed by the rest of the community as some sort of criticism or statement that they weren't doing a good job. A lot of people said, you all are in some ways the good housekeeping seal of approval. And if you stop funding us, then other people are going to stop funding us. I actually think there are so many fantastic foundations and donors in Houston now that I think that turns out not to be true. But we tried to be as explicit as we could when we narrowed our focus, that we weren't getting out of these other issues because we didn't care about them and because the organizations doing the work weren't great organizations, but it was just because we couldn't do everything all at once. And so we continue to fund, take homelessness, for example. We probably funded $13 to $17 million to really change the homeless system, and some great work was done in our region around homelessness. We've scaled that way back, and we're funding the Backbone organization and a few other pieces of it, but we really scaled back from that. We're not doing a lot of environmental work anymore. We're really backing away from environmental work right now. I think, and that's really hard. But the good news is there were wonderful things that were achieved, and there's some really strong organizations carrying that work forward. So, there are a lot of issues that we're not regularly funding general operating support to right now. But again, that doesn't mean we won't always. And to your point, to focus and do justice to these really important issues that we've selected, we had to let go of some things, at least for the time being. We also, for most of the organizations that we stopped funding, we provided additional years of transition funding too, because we were just cognizant that a lot of people were relying on our dollars and we didn't want to pull the rug out from under them in an abrupt way.
Armando Perez, some of the people on the call here today, he runs HEB in Houston, and he's probably the best person I've ever seen at managing bandwidth. And his line frequently to people who ask him to take on something new is, I can do 5 things and be excellent, or I can be 10 things and be average. So you tell me which you want me to do. And it sounds like really that's what you've looked to do, is to say, look, let's make a real difference in terms of these focus areas. And when you have to dilute your giving across 60 different, you'll make less of an impact. And I think the fact that you've provided for transitional funding to allow people to look at other areas, I think is certainly useful. And we'll open it up to questions. There have been a whole bunch of them that come in just a minute, but what should leaders from all sectors and people who are on this call be thinking about as we move towards recovery? What do you see? I mean, look, this has lasted way longer than any of us ever thought. And I think for many of us, you kind of pull your vision in, and instead of looking out a year, you say, I got to get through this week. Oh, now I got to get through next week. And a term, if you read a New York Times article earlier this week, it says at one end of the spectrum is flourishing, on the other end is depression, and in the middle sits languishing. And I think a lot of people are just kind of languishing, waiting for this to be over. But as we do start to look farther out than a week or 2 weeks ahead, what do you see?
Yeah, I think people are just tired. And so I think being kind to each other, trying to move beyond this divisiveness and partisanship that has even crept into a lot of the issues related to the pandemic. It's just thinking about how we can be part of coming together and finding that common ground instead of adding to the divisiveness. I think the 2 other things I'd say, and they're related. One is understanding that all of these issues, you can't change them unless you work on them at a systems level. And that includes the public policies that are at play. And so get engaged in those public policies, really understand how they're impacting the issues that are so dramatically impacting our region and our country. And then the notion that working collectively is critical. And so figuring out who are the coalitions that are getting aligned around solving problems and how can you be part of them and what's the role that you can play that's most helpful to them.
Now, maybe the biggest message for everyone is, look, find a way to make a difference. I tell the story about HEB frequently because people say, well, how come you guys get your stores open so quickly in times of disaster? And I think at everyone's core, and it doesn't matter if you're a checker at HEB or for you or someone who's on this call, I think all people desire to be able to make a difference and being able, but it's to take the initiative to step up and do it. And there are times, and there's certainly plenty of needs, and we've talked about many of them here today, whether it's education or homelessness, civic engagement, diversity, racism, et cetera, is if there's an area that speaks to people, to find a way to get involved is a way in which you create change, is by having a lot of people and it becoming a movement. That if it's left up to a few people, even people who have access to large funding like you, it doesn't have. And I mean, look, if you look at the way in which, go back to how Obama funded his campaign, it wasn't necessarily as much over huge donations as it was about group source funding. And I think the same thing can be looked at in terms of the ability to make a difference. And so you look at some of these changes, and you and I talk about education all the time, and it can start with something I think as simple as making a statement of who is it that we want to be as a city. We want to be a city where no one goes to a D or F school, and everyone, we lead the country in terms of students being able to graduate from college. Well, that's not the reality today, but if you state that as a goal and you live into that, you'll make progress. And maybe we won't be first, but we'll certainly be better than where we are today. And so I think that's the cry out to the public. And frankly, before I moved to Houston, I was moderately, I was involved in United Way in San Antonio, where I lived there before. The great thing about Houston is that if you want to contribute, it doesn't make, you don't have to be you or me to be able to do it. Anyone can find a way to get involved, and together we can make a big difference in it. Okay, let's do this. We're going to have an 8-minute, 2-minute drill. In other words, a 2-minute drill meaning I'll fire you fast questions, but we've got 8 minutes left before we have to wrap up. So I'll just read off of some that came in. So one question came in. What's the geographic focus? Like, do you invest in Dallas or do you only invest in Harris County? But how big of an area do you look at investing?
Our region is Greater Houston, which includes Harris County and the surrounding counties. We do fund organizations outside of that area if they have a significant impact on the residents of that region.
Got it. Do you still distribute the Mary Gibbs scholarships?
We do not. We shifted those funds. That was a fantastic program. But about 8 years ago, we realized that we were only impacting a certain number of specific students with those scholarships. And instead, we funded programs at the University of Texas for Houston area students, and we funded the Emerge program at HISD that provided not just the dollars for scholarships, but also all the social and non-academic supports that the kids needed to be successful. So we've been really pleased with that transition.
So if you look at the impact of coronavirus on households and families, and it certainly hit a large variety of people, but can you discuss how the low and moderate income households have fared during the pandemic? Has the hit been worse to them? And how has it impacted their work outcomes and labor force participation?
Well, that is beyond my pay grade to answer some of those questions. I will say that disasters, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a flood, whether it's a global health pandemic, always hits the lower income families harder because they have less cushion. And I think about some of the students that we saw in the scholarship program who would literally say, I'm a flat tire away from having to drop out of school. If I have a flat tire, I don't have the funds to be able to pay for that. And you all have all seen the numbers about the average savings that the average family has across Houston. There's no cushion. There's no grace.
Isn't it incredible that like one paycheck away from becoming homeless for so many people, the average amount of savings that are out there? And then you hear of a statistic that says about half of all kids who who are either in 2-year or 4-year colleges say that the pandemic is going to have some impact on their ability to finish. Either it will take longer or they won't be able to finish. And our friend Scott Murray, who was the superintendent at Spring Branch School District, moved out to Odessa, and his school district was the subject of a New York Times podcast called The Daily. It's a 4 or 5-part series, and in it they featured many high school students from Odessa Permian High School, and these kids were having to drop out of school or try to attend school while they worked. And I remember one girl in particular, she was working at like a Jamba Juice while she had an earphone in her ear trying to listen to her math class. And I mean, it's just the economic reality of people having to pool together, and that changes the true reality of what you're faced with in terms of trying to get ahead, but then being dealt this blow and just having to try to live from one paycheck or one subsidy check from another. Yeah. I think we've also seen the good news is for low-income families is that there has been good governmental support, and I can speak from an HEB standpoint. Is so we've seen large increases in food stamps help low-income families. There have been the PPP loans that have come through for families who earn forgivable loans who earn less than $150,000. There's been unemployment, but unemployment is now over. The PPP is over. The final tranche of food stamps will be allocated this next month. And I know one of the things that we've been worried a lot about is when that stops, is what happens then, because there still are a lot of people who are unemployed. And frankly, there have been some people who've chosen to say, look, I don't necessarily have to rush to get back to work because I have had some safety net underneath me. But as I look forward to next year, I think the true economic reality in terms of people not having the support is going to be there. Have you guys looked at that at all?
Yeah, I mean, yes, definitely. I mean, I think the federal dollars have made a huge difference in people's lives, and now that they're sort of wrapping up, that's going to be a problem. Also think about the education system, the public school system. The federal dollars coming in through ESSER, $2.1 billion coming to Houston area schools from those ESSER dollars. That's huge. But of course, that's not a long-term funding source. And so how do we make sure that those dollars, how do we support the districts allocating those dollars for things that are going to either deal with this immediate learning loss or actually invest in the future in addressing some of those inequities in the future versus just having to go to capital projects?
Yeah, it's such a good point, because the money is great, but if it isn't put to good use, then you've got good dollars, chasing bad execution or bad implementation as you go through for there. What advice would you have for somebody who is either starting a nonprofit or is involved with a smaller nonprofit in terms of what advice would you give to them in terms of how to do, look, everyone wants to do better. So how do you do better and be better at the same time?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question. First of all, I'd say, and I'm sure anyone would do this, but really understand the landscape and who out there is already doing some of that work. And sometimes I've seen leaders who think they want to start a nonprofit and then realize that actually they can be stronger and focus more on the things that are important to them if they become a program or a part of an established nonprofit. They don't have to create a separate board and create a separate articles of incorporation and bylaws and all of the tax rules. So I'd say think a lot about the administrative costs and the distractions of that before you create a nonprofit, and consider whether there is a better way to achieve what you're trying to achieve.
Great. I think that's probably a good place for us to wrap up right there. And thank you so much, not just for being with us today, but more importantly, thank you. And thanks to the Houston Endowment for making Houston a better place for all of us to live. And it's a pleasure to get to visit with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Scott. I'd say the same to you. Thank you for everything you do for this community.
All right, Brett, we'll throw it back to you.
Well, Ann and Scott, that was really an amazing conversation. And it just reminds me that the real resource we have is not the dollar so much, it's the people. And you guys have been magnificent leaders in the city of Houston, really have shown great thought leadership on a number of very important issues. And I'll just say, I learned a lot from hearing you talk about some of the unique cultural treasures that we have, and most importantly, about how to be excellent in doing just a few things. So thank you so much for the comments and for the discussion. I think we learned a ton from you today. We are going to basically continue this discussion in a couple of weeks, a similar discussion, maybe a little bit with a focus on energy and climate when we have Catherine Hayhoe join us on October the 6th. So I hope you'll join us for that. This has been just a marvelous series of really thought-provoking leaders who have been part of our webcast series this year, and just want to thank all of you who have participated for joining in and being part of the discussion. And hopefully we'll see you next time. Bye now.